Okay, so I'll try to keep this down to about an hour, but this is the exam for chapters 1 through 3. And to begin with, again, economics is the study of scarcity. A lot of people think that they think it's more has to do with finance or money and so on and so forth, which of course it does, but it goes well beyond that when we start talking about scarcity. Scarcity is around us well beyond just the financial end of things. At any rate, so when we're talking about economics, on the right is the circular flow of real economic activity, and we'll walk through a couple of different aspects. We'll be going back and forth with the circular flow throughout the course, of course, but at any rate, microeconomics. In the microeconomics, we're looking at the what or the output mix, and that would be on the top, the inside inner circle, if you will, on the top, going from the firm to the household. The how is that input mix that's flowing from the household to the firm in terms of labor, capital, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. Anyhow, again, the output mix are the consumer goods, and it also has to do with the non-consumption spending, which we'll get to that in a bit, so far as investment, government expenditures, and exports. So for whom is that would be the income distribution, and that is the portion that flows on the bottom part, the people that get those goodies, those consumer items, if you will, from the firm, and the income distribution is the portion, the income that's awarded to the productive resources, the household rather, for the use of their productive resources. So that would include, again, income distribution would be wages, interest, profit, rent. Wages going to labor, interest going to capital. Remember, capital is the physical capital, but the underlying part of that physical capital is that financial capital, the owners of the company, if you will, the owners of the firm. Profit, likewise, would be going to be paid to capital, would be paid to the entrepreneur. Remember, their compensation, the entrepreneur's compensation, is through stock options. So that's kind of their pay, if you will, for an entrepreneur. And of course, labor could also be receiving some of the profits in terms of profit sharing. Rent, of course, goes to land, and land is once again the land upon which we walk, but also all of the natural resources under the land, if you will, under the ground. So that's kind of micro. Micro is what you'll notice is that we're drilling down on very specific areas within the context of this circular flow. Whereas when we're looking at macro, we're looking at approaching it a little differently, and that is that on the macro side, it's kind of three pillars of macro. Those would be employment or unemployment, price level changes, inflation, deflation, disinflation, economic growth, which would be measured a variety of ways, but the one we'll focus on is GDP, gross domestic product. And gross domestic product includes the final value of all goods and services at market prices. So all that production that goes on in this circular flow, with respect to the firm, for example, that's going to show up in going to end up in this GDP, gross domestic products. Now, it's not just the firm, but kind of all roads lead to the firm so far as production is concerned, at any rate, or for the most part. It would also include, again, investment at the firm, which is the firm itself, government expenditures, that's government spending, but typically most government spending is on products that are being produced by the firm, and of course exports are, again, from the firm. And lastly, the largest component are the consumer goods and services flowing directly from the firm to the household. Again, that's economic growth, all right? So the other thing is, this is kind of a follow-on with micro. It's kind of a mix between micro and macro, but actually the trade portion of it would probably be more micro. And so that answers kind of the question why. It's kind of an add-on to the above portion with micro, and that's the reason for trade, the international reason, international trade in this context, so far as our circular flow is concerned. But it's trade on any level. And trade is based on something that we call comparative advantage. And in that, if you have a comparative advantage, one country over another, you would be focusing your production on that. So for example, the U.S., we have a very large amount of arable land upon which we've grow a number of crops and corn, wheat, soybean, etc. And we are a net exporter of farm products, of agricultural goods, as opposed to a country like Japan with not so much land, if you will, for one, and also the land that they do have is not very conducive to growing a wide variety of crops like it would be in the U.S. So this is the basis kind of for trade, the comparative advantage. The other example that I'll show you another example of this comparative advantage in a moment, but the thing that we key upon with comparative advantage is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost has to do with what you surrender or you forego, your next best competitive option. So the example that we used for that was Justin Verlander. Justin Verlander, the pitcher for the formerly Detroit Tigers and now Houston Astros, was earning $28 million per year, 38-year-old college graduate with a degree in business from Virginia Commonwealth University, I believe. And you would say, what would his next best competitive option be if he were not a major league pitcher earning $28 million per year? And that would probably be, and we're being very generous, $150,000 a year salary working in business somewhere, right? So what we're saying then is that the opportunity cost is so huge, the difference between the two. We're saying that he is being overcompensated because his next best competitive option would be, again, that $150,000 job as working in business somewhere. And the point being, again, is that when we're focusing on this opportunity cost, we're kind of we're looking at what ought to be, what really should be, so far as a term that we use over and over again in terms of equity. Equity means that you're receiving your just desserts, you're receiving your opportunity cost level of compensation for the use of your productive resources. So this is the firm paying the household for the use of its productive resources, that income distribution, paying opportunity cost level of compensation for the use of those productive resources for your labor, entrepreneurship, capital, land. At any rate, back to this comparative advantage. So the basis, again, for comparative advantage is really hinges upon this opportunity cost. You focus on that which you have a lower opportunity cost, meaning it's more efficient, more effective for you to produce, like the U.S. to produce wheat, and to Japan to produce electronic goods, for example. And so that would be kind of the trade-off. The opportunity costs associated with it for the U.S. would be lower in terms of producing agricultural products than it would be for producing take your pick, something else where there's a higher opportunity cost for U.S. production over Japan. Okay, so comparative advantage. This is the lawyer versus the paralegal. Okay, so you've got one person who's a paralegal, and this paralegal was the best paralegal. It's like the legal secretary, super legal secretary. They do all the research and do a lot of stuff for the attorneys, for an attorney's office. And a very good paralegal is something that they can be paid quite well. So we'll just say that they're being compensated $50 an hour, okay, for being a paralegal, and they're extremely efficient at it, and they're the best in the area by far. And so as they're doing their paralegal work, they think, hey, why don't I just become a lawyer? So they become a lawyer, pass the bar, and now you're a newly fresh stamped lawyer coming out of the box. And the question is, do you continue to be a paralegal, or do you become a lawyer, or do you split both? Since you're so good at being a paralegal, do some of the work for yourself while you're an attorney. Okay, so it comes down to something very, very simple: this opportunity cost. So what we're saying is that an attorney would be paid. We'll just assume that they're billing at a rate of $100 per hour. It's probably more than that, but we'll just say $100 per hour versus a paralegal billing at $50 per hour. This person is far better off, regardless of the fact that they're They're an average at best lawyer just starting out versus the top-notch paralegal. The compensation is much, much higher for the lawyer. So you're better off focusing your efforts, if you will, on being a lawyer than being a paralegal. That's comparative advantage. Again, you can get into all the different nuances, but that's kind of the takeaway from that, is that we're comparing, that's the comparative advantage, and it's also the opportunity cost, focusing on your lower opportunity cost, of course, being a lawyer than being a paralegal. Okay, just a few different things here. One thing to keep in mind so far as income goes to three places. It's first you pay your taxes. After that, you've got your disposable income, right? And from your disposable income, what you consume, your personal consumption expenditures, and then whatever's left over, the residual is savings. So income goes to taxes, consumption, personal consumption expenditures, and the residual goes to saving. So onward. So when we're talking about injections, injections would be non-consumption, or excuse me, before we get into injections, let's do a definitional thing here. When we talk about consumption, the personal consumption expenditures are two different types of personal consumption expenditures. One would be durable, the other non-durable. And for durable, those are long-lasting items. So, for example, vehicle purchases, appliances, furniture, so on and so forth. As for the household, for the household purchases, those are durable versus non-durable, things that we use up very, very quickly. For example, like the gasoline in your car, and your lunch when you're buying food, etc. Those are considered non-durable goods. And so far as the non-consumption spending is concerned, that has to do with those are identifiers, if you will, for injections. I'm not on the right slide here. I was going to look at the point out on the circular flow, but if you look at your circular flow diagram, this would be on the top right portion. And those are also what are called injections. So these are injections. They go beyond consumption. The injections would include GPDI. Again, these are non-consumption. This is non-consumption spending. GPDI, gross private domestic investment. That's investment at the firm. Specifically, when we use the term investment, we tend to think about it again financially, and which it is, of course, but more so in this respect, we're looking at it in terms of investment, in terms of physical capital goods that are flowing into the firm. They're being produced by the firm for the firm. And we'll speak more to that when we talk about the production possibility curve or frontier on the right. Government spending is GCE and GI, very similar to the consumption, non-durable and durable. It's the same idea with government spending. Government spending would be GCE, government consumption expenditures, that would be non-durable, versus durable, which would be gross investment. So that's spending at the government. These are all injections, and the reason, we'll get to that in a moment. Lastly would be exports. Exports, of course, are goods and services that are produced at the firm but are shipped off to other countries. So the reason they're injections is because the GPDI, for example, that's investment at the firm is producing them, and whenever the firm produces anything, they have to use what? They have to use productive resources. And the productive resources that are employed at the firm, of course, would be compensated, which adds to the income. And again, income goes to taxes, consumption, saving. We hold taxes and saving constant, for example, and that would be adding to consumption, and more consumption, of course, means more goods and services that would be produced, etc. So that's GPDI, GC, and GI, very similar in terms of whenever government spends on anything, that also causes the economy to explode or to expand or to grow. And typically, again, most things that our government purchases are the government purchases, they're purchasing them from the firm. Same idea. More goods, they're being produced at the firm, and the productive resources receiving the income associated with that production. Lastly, exports, again, same idea. They're injections because they're being produced at the firm, and the productive resources employed in that production process are being compensated in the form of that income distribution. The flip side of this is the withdrawals or leakages. This causes the economy to implode or to shrink, if you will. Saving, imports, and taxes. So saving, again, looking at our income goes to taxes, consumption, savings. So taxes aside, if we increase our saving, reduce our consumption, that means there's going to be less demand for those goods and services that are being produced at the firm once again. So it causes that to be pulled back a bit if saving increases. Imports are considered withdrawal or leakage because, once again, it's not being produced at the firm. In fact, it's kind of a double hit because the goods and services are being produced by other countries and in other countries, and also our financial resources are going to pay for those, our domestic financial resources. So that money is leaving the country in essence. Finally, taxes. I have a note on here, ultimately all borne by household. Keep that in mind. Taxes are also withdrawal because it reduces our ability to what? To consume. Straightforward. 2021, the deficit was the 2.8 trillion, and it's likely to be for a 2022 fiscal year. It's likely to be north of $2 trillion again. If we're lucky, it'll be 1.5 trillion. But these are huge, huge numbers. And basically, when we're talking about this deficit, it's revenue minus expense, meaning the revenue, the taxes that are flowing in versus the expenditures by government, and the result would be a surplus if their revenues exceed expenses, or a deficit if the opposite is the case, where expenses exceed revenue, which they have for the last 20 plus years. Anyway, which is all this rolls up into that overall debt, and currently we're $28.4 trillion, and I'm sure at this point it's closer to $30 trillion or beyond before long. So again, my example of opportunity cost, the other example I had, we talked about Justin Verlander already, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, but opportunity cost, the example with my niece was that if I had a choice between giving my niece $100 for her graduation from high school or not. And so I opted to, I could do something else for her. I could give her a gift of some sort, but I came down to the $100, whether I give it to her or not. And so I have to weigh the cost. It's my opportunity cost. But once I give my niece the $100, it becomes her opportunity. It's transferred over to her, the opportunity cost. She's in possession of the $100, and from there she has the choices of what to spend it on. A new pair of jeans or something like that, or some clothing, or maybe concert tickets. And again, whatever choice that she made, I forget what it was now. I don't know what she may have saved it too. But that's where she has to weigh her opportunity cost. What is her next best competitive option? Justin Verlander, again, was the pitcher that we had talked about before, earning $28 million a year. And real briefly, I want to talk about equity and equality. It's something that we will revisit a few times more in this class, obviously, going forward, a bit later in the course in particular. But I try to bring it up on occasion because it's a very important point, and that is that equity versus equality. We don't have an equal income distribution in this country. In fact, we have what's called a disparate income distribution, and growing disparate income distribution, meaning inequality. So the objective, first off, do we want a more equal income distribution? I think everyone would agree with that. Something closer to, where everybody is earning closer to the same salary. But the distinction, what I'm getting at is, and we refer to this term equity. Equity is that you are receiving your opportunity cost level of compensation for the use of your productive resources, right? So you're getting your opportunity cost level of compensation. What that means is that you are receiving again your just desserts. So one of the reasons that you're going to school, of course, is do you want to be at that income equality mark, or do you want to be above? Justification for being more than that equal income distribution, that $70,000 per year per household. If you have two household income earners, that would be $35,000 per year each. If you wanted to be above that, the justification for that would be through this concept, this idea called equity. And what equity again speaks to is that opportunity cost level of compensation, meaning you work harder, you've invested a lot in human capital, taking courses like this, etc. So anyway, onward we go. I wanted to talk about production possibility frontier, production possibility curve, production possibility model. They all mean the same thing. And this goes back to when I was talking before about the GPDI, the investment at the firm. So in this representation, we have the production possibility curve, the consumer goods on the y-axis, the vertical axis, capital goods being on the x-axis or the horizontal axis. And the B represents, again, that's our production possibility curve. Any point along this production possibility curve is called productive efficiency. You are being efficient in a productive manner, okay, however you want to phrase it. And specific points along this curve would be what's called allocative efficiency, where you're focusing your efforts on either more consumer goods or some combination of consumer goods and capital goods. The idea, of course, the rationale for the reason behind why this curve bends in the manner in which it does, this concave curve, is that the opportunity cost comes into play. Because if you want to produce more consumer goods, of course, it comes at what? The cost of producing fewer capital goods, and vice versa. Anyhow, so that's that production possibility curve or frontier, what that line represents. So the two choices that we have, consumer goods or capital goods. Consumer goods would be goods for the household, as you know, that for consumption purposes and so on and so forth. The capital goods would be for production at the firm, for the firm. And the reason that we want to produce more capital goods is what? To end up producing more consumer goods down the road. So this is kind of that, that balance, if you will, between the two. And okay, at any rate, furthermore, when we're talking about this production possibility curve or frontier, there are three different points I want you to look at. First is B, which is odd, but that's that point of efficiency. Anywhere along that production possibility curve is efficient, and the specific points would be having to do with allocative efficiency. A means that we're operating inefficiently, meaning that we're not using all of our productive resources, because that's what pushes us out to that production possibility curve, is using all of our productive resources to the best of their capability, best of their ability. Labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land, any combination. This is their point as far as we can push that production using those productive resources. So if we're at point A, of course, we're not using all of our productive resources productively in an efficient manner. So that would be, just for lack of a better, it's an easy way to look at it would be that, for example, there would be a lot of unemployment at point A. So we've got point B, point A, and now point C is beyond our production possibility curve, hint, meaning that we cannot, because remember, we're using our productive resources. That's the maximum that we can use them, that we can use them efficiently is at point B. So we cannot attain at point C beyond that production possibility curve or frontier. The way we get there, and we'll talk about this at another time, kind of moving forward, and that is that by increasing either our quantity or quality of the productive resources that we have, or some combination therein. More people, developing more human capital on the labor side, etc. More robots. It's typically the way that we kind of look at this. So Adam Smith was called a moral philosopher, and he wrote a book in 1776 called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And he's kind of considered to be the father of modern economics, if you will. There's not to say that there wasn't anything before him. There was quite a lot out there, including places like in Spain and so on and so, the Salamanca School, lots of places where there was definitely economics that was under consideration, along with the physiocrats in France about the same time. But the interesting thing about Adam Smith was that, again, his background, he was a moral philosopher, meaning that he keyed up his work upon morality, of course, and intertwined with philosophy. And his book preceding this by about, I don't know, maybe 15 years or so was called Moral Sentiments. It was a longer title than that, but that's kind of the theory of moral sentiments, something along those lines. And with this in mind, Adam Smith is also considered by many to be the father of sociology too, modern sociology. But at any rate, the basis or the Wealth of Nations covered a lot of different topics. It was a big book, and one of the main thing that comes out of it that pretty much everyone points to is called the invisible hand of competition, and it's only mentioned a couple of times in the Wealth of Nations, but nonetheless, it's the basis, if you will, explaining how this competitive model works, that this competitive free market capitalistic model actually works. And the basis for this, of course, I've talked about it in class, is that the invisible hand of competition is what it's another way of looking at it is by pursuing your own personal benefit, if you will, your own personal interest, you cannot help but to benefit, mankind, if you will, along the same lines. And the reason that, of course, happens is, as we've talked about in class quite a bit, with this competitive model, it's what keeps prices competitive, just that. If a competitor tries to raise prices, of course, the competition steps in and says, okay, I can lower prices and still earn an opportunity cost level profit, for example. Anyway, that's the invisible hand, always, reaching in and moving markets, if you will, back to that equilibrium point. Again, assuming that there's adequate competition, right? So the different types of economic systems, the one that we've kind of talked about quite a bit and centers on that circular flow of real economic activity is a competitive free market capitalism. And that's the circular flow without government involved. This is laissez-faire economy, leave it alone. In other words, no government involvement at all. So, of course, there's no such thing, but that's kind of the basis, if you will, for this, our circular flow, our free market capitalism, more specifically competitive when we throw the invisible hand in there, keeping that in play. Mixed economy is more the reality in the world. There are different degrees of government involvement. So the U.S. versus, say, for example, like with Europe, European economy countries have much more government involvement than the U.S. does. Nonetheless, these are mixed economies that kind of run the whole gamut. Command economy, of course, would be communism, socialism, communism, like a North Korea type regime where there's absolute control over all of those productive resources, over the production process. The entrepreneur, the role of the entrepreneur is filled by the state through boards like commissars and so on and so forth, again, as we described in class. China is probably closer to a command economy. It's moved somewhat toward a mixed economy, but nonetheless, it definitely, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, runs the show in China. Don't ever doubt that. Anyhow, tribal economy, that's barter. Barter is, again, where there's no money involved. And we have barter today, so it's not like it's gone away, but those economies that are based on barter are gone, pretty much. It's, again, there's still barter, but not economies that are not based on money, if you will, financial currency, etc. Anyway, there may be one or two that are out there, but I can't even name them. They would be so small, so far removed. The next thing we're looking at is this whole concept, moving into the concept of demand. And I'm jumping right in. I see that there's not really any line of demarcation, so we're moving into demand, effective demand. Effective demand means that you have to have the financial resources, remember ceteris paribus, we're assuming that there, whenever we see demand, we're talking about effective demand, where you have the financial resources to back up whatever it is, those products that we're talking about. Anyway, how and why is the quantity demand inversely or negatively related to the price of a good or service in question? Again, this is the law of demand. Law of demand dictates that as the price goes up, the quantity demand falls, or the quantity demand is reduced, if you will. So this is movement along that demand curve. Demand curve is, shows here with the price on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and the quantity on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, and the demand curve is sloping downward to the right as it does most all the time, except for in the case that we talked about, like with a Giffen good, for example. Again, that's the law of demand. Price goes up, quantity demanded is reduced or goes down. So again, when we're talking about demand, we look at two different ways. One is the change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand. So a change in quantity demanded, I've talked about this several times in the class, but this is something I do recommend that you kind of write this down. Like, just have a piece of paper next to you as you take your exams and just kind of sketch these things out. Sketch out a demand curve, what the relationships are, and so on and so forth, supply, demand, etc. So change in quantity demand rather is movement along the demand curve driven by a change in price and price alone. As opposed to a change in demand, it's shifting the entire curve. Remember, that curve is the entire demand curve. That downward sloping curve, that straight line in this case, that is the demand curve, and that's the entire curve. So a change in demand means that we're shifting the demand. So we're shifting the entire demand curve irrespective of price. Price, of course, is typically involved as well, but other things than just price. So again, we're talking about a shift in the entire demand curve, not moving along the demand curve, which is driven by a price change, as in change in quantity demanded. So these change in demand, different things that would affect it would be the income effect, quality, advertising, substitution effect, substitutes, complements, expectations, weather. So first, we'll talk about the income effect. The income effect, what that says is that, we'll just say, for example, if your income increases, that would cause that entire demand curve to shift to the right, assuming that we're talking about normal goods. Normal goods are almost all goods that we're talking about, right? And again, that causes the demand curve to shift to the right with an increase in income, or if it's a decrease in income, it's shifting to the left. Remember, when we're talking about shifting demand curves or shifting supply curves, movement increase is shifting to the right, decrease is shifting to the left. So that's, again, the income effect. Increase in income shifts the demand curve to the right, decrease in income shifts the demand curve to the left. Substitutes. Substitution effect. What that indicates is that if the price of good A goes up, the quantity demanded of good B goes up, meaning if they are substitutes, if they are reasonable substitutes one for another. Pickup trucks was an example I've kind of thrown out in the past. So you take a Chevy Silverado pickup truck versus a Ford F-150 pickup truck, very similar, similarly decked out, if you will. And so if the price of the Silverado goes up by $1,000, chances are that the quantity demanded of the F-150 would increase accordingly, right? Because the price of one good A goes up, the quantity demanded of good B goes up. These are complements. And that also speaks to when we talk about the sum of, when we're summing up demand curves, as we're adding demand curves together, the demand curve itself flattens out, and the flattening of the demand curve is very, very important. We'll talk about that further as we kind of go along, but again, that's when we have substitutes, we're looking at a flatter demand curve versus a steeper demand curve, which speaks to when we talk about quality, increasing quality shifts the demand curve. Advertising will also shift the demand curve, and this would be moving in the opposite direction of a substitution effect. Whereas with a substitution effect, you end up with a flatter demand curve. With the advertising, you would have a steeper demand curve. The demand curve steepens because assuming the advertising is effective and people are less impacted, if you will, less sensitive to those price level changes, price elasticity of demand. Complements are goods that go together, meaning that if a price of good A goes up, that means that the quantity demanded of good B, they're assuming their complements, goes down. Peanut butter and jelly, the price of peanut butter goes up, the quantity demanded of jelly is reduced, the demand actually for jelly actually reduces. Other things go along with that, including a whole variety of things that I talk about, weather, income distribution, etc. So these are all things that spell a shift in demand. So again, as we just indicated, we're talking primarily, well, there are more than this, the things that impact the demand curves, but these are the ones that are kind of the most evident, if you will. One is the substitution effect, another is the income effect. And again, speaking to the income effect first, since nearly all goods are normal goods, when the price rises for the good, the quantity demanded is reduced, right? And so when we talk about the actual income effect, we're actually talking about the shift in demand, meaning if we have a decrease in income, the demand curve shifts inward to the right, correct? I should say to the left, excuse me, inward, closer to the origin, so it would be leftward. I'm getting myself backward here. So again, if reading from the top here, that if the good is a normal good, as most goods are, most all goods are normal goods, other than like Giffen goods, for example, that's the exception to the demand curve sloping downward to the right. The income effect results in buying more of those goods when the price has fallen. If the price of a good rises, the income and substitution effect would then reduce the quantity demanded, hence the law of demand. Both of these are working in concert, the income effect and substitution effect, to reinforce, if you will, that law of demand. Substitution effect, again, when the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded for that good decreases due to the availability of substitutes, other goods that are out there, other options. Price of good A goes up, quantity demanded of good B, a substitute, that goes up. Okay, it's moving together. Okay, so onward we go to price elasticity of demand. So when we talk about price elasticity, we mean sensitivity to price level changes, right? Obviously, as the law of demand dictates, as the price goes up, the quantity demanded is reduced. And so what we're really looking at when we're looking at the price elasticity of demand, we're looking at that sensitivity to those price level changes. So if you have a steeper demand curve, the sensitivity in general would be less than if you have a flatter demand curve. Meaning movement, raising the price on a flatter demand curve, of course, is going to cause a greater reduction in that demand, if you will, the quantity demanded. At any rate, so price elasticity of demand, this is our representation of price elasticity of demand in terms of looking at this in terms of total revenue, seeing the shape of the demand curve and so on and so forth. So first on our demand curve, we're looking at the midpoint. That's also called the unitary elastic point. That's the midpoint, again, between the y-axis on the price axis on the left and the quantity axis on the right, moving down, if you will, or up the demand curve, the midpoint of that demand curve, right? So it's a very important point. Again, we call it the unitary elastic or the unit elastic point. And below that point, moving to the right, that's called what we call the inelastic range. And if you're in the inelastic range, what that means is that if you have a price increase, that means that it's revenue enhancing. Remember, revenue is equal to price times quantity. So for any good entrepreneur, all you really care about is what? Increased revenue. You don't care about the price or the quantity. But if you're in the inelastic range, you remain in the inelastic range up to the unitary elastic point or the inelastic point, the midpoint, then if you increase prices, then that's going to result in increased revenue. Looking at our total revenue curve beneath that demand curve. Moving beyond that, moving leftward closer to the price or the y-axis, moving up the demand curve past that unitary elastic point, what you find is that if you have a price increase, that results in what? Less revenue, okay? So it's very, very important to find that midpoint, find that unit elastic point. If you're, as an entrepreneur, you're always searching for that, because remember, when we're looking here, we're looking at a very static arrangement. This demand curve is a straight line demand curve. It could be curvilinear. They shift all the time for a variety of reasons. So you're always searching, trying to find the right price. And if you're in the elastic range and you happen to raise price, you end up losing revenue. So what do? You reduce revenue. You have sales, so on and so forth, in order to clear out your stock, your inventory, if you will. All right. So again, this is that price elasticity of demand. And there are all kinds of other elasticities, not just price elasticity of demand. It could be income elasticity and any variety of things. And we're talking about the sensitivity ultimately to those price level changes. Okay. So further, price elasticity of demand. A demand curve facing a firm that slopes downward to the right indicates that the firm has some degree of market power or price power. Because again, this downward sloping demand curve, this is also what's referred to as the average revenue curve. What that indicates is that, the firm, the business, if you will, has some degree of market power, meaning that they control prices a bit. Again, when we have a demand curve that's not horizontal or flat, then you can raise prices to increase revenue, assuming you remain where? In the inelastic range. Okay? So price elasticity of demand, the actual definition for that is sorry about the background noise, would be the change in quantity demanded divided by the change in prices, strictly speaking. So something to remember on the exam. So QD1 minus QD2 divided by QD1. That's the percentage change in quantity demanded over that percentage change in price. P1 minus P2 divided by P1. Okay? Anyhow, that's it for price elasticity of demand, and onward we move. So on we go to supply. Very similar. Remember, they're moving in opposite directions, where a demand curve has an inverse relationship or a negative relationship sloping downward to the right. The law of supply dictates as price goes up, quantity supplied is increased. And anyway, so it's a similar idea, except they're moving in the opposite direction. Price goes up, quantity supplied increases. And the rationale behind it is twofold. They're more than this, but we'll just look at two different reasons. One, of course, is the profit motive. If prices are higher, then of course the supplier will want to do what? Supply more goods and services to sell, and meeting that demand, meeting the demand requirements, if you will. The other idea behind this is that it goes back to our production possibility curve, and that is that the more we produce of something, the more expensive it becomes in terms of the other product. So if we remember consumer goods and capital goods, if we produce more consumer goods, it becomes more expensive in terms of those capital goods that we're not producing. And it's the same idea with the law of supply, is that we have what? We have limits. We have limited resources. We have scarcity as present. So that's also kind of the real story behind the supply curve. It also indicates what this is another, the supply curve sloping upward to the right also is a measure of cost, if you will. And that would be something that would be explored in micro going further. At any rate, so rightward movement is an increase in demand. Leftward movement is a decrease in demand when we talk about a shift in supply or a shift in demand, or a shift in supply or shift in demand, either one, right? So anyway, rightward movement up the demand supply curve is a quantity increase. Leftward is a quantity decrease. And again, as we indicated, we're expectation of higher profits, and also, as we talked before about a change in quantity demand, that means movement along the demand curve driven by what? By price and price alone. Similarly, a change in quantity supplied is the same, is caused by the same thing, a change in price and price alone, price and price only, okay? So again, similar to demand, when we're talking about a change in demand or a change in supply, that means we're shifting supply. And so when we talk about a shift in supply or shift in demand, again, I'll say it one more time, moving to the right would be an increase in supply or demand. Moving to the left, closer to the origin, would be a decrease in supply and demand or demand. So in our representation here, we're showing S1 to the right of S2, moving from S1 to S2, that's reduction, leftward movement in supply. And changes in supply can be caused by any number of things, ranging from change in the cost of inputs, whether they're reduced or increased, whether they're the cost goes up or cost goes down. That would, if the costs go up, that would reduce supply. Costs go down, increasing supply. More competitors would cause an increase in supply, shifting supply to the right again, etc. Change in the physical production facility, change in weather, bumper crop, shift supply to the right. Improvements in technology, remember we're assuming, ceteris paribus, that the technology is working properly. And if that's the case, then we would be shifting supply to the right again. Taxes go up, it would shift supply to the left. It's a cost to the firm. Government subsidies would cause our supply to shift to the right. And at any rate, this is kind of a walkthrough on supply and demand, and now we're walking through supply. Just as is the case with demand, there is an exception to the law of supply, and that would be, it's called the backward bending supply curve, and we use that in terms of labor was our example. And when we talk about, we divide our day up, if you will. Our 24-hour day is comprised of two things when you boil right down to it, is going to be work and leisure. Leisure is anything that you're doing that's not work, sleep, etc., right? That's leisure. And work, of course, we know what work is. And so we can make an assumption that this is pretty clear, is that leisure is a normal good. So in other words, the more income that we have, the more leisure that we want. So there's the trade-off, of course, between work and leisure, and that in order to acquire leisure, it's a normal good. You have to do what? You have to work. And you need to have the financial resources to back up to use that, take advantage of that leisure. At any rate, the backward bending supply curve of labor is when we reach that point, so far as the increase in price of our labor, where we say, no, it doesn't matter how much more money you're going to give me. There are only so many hours in a day, and I'm not going to work more than 60 hours a week, or something along those lines. That's the backward bending supply curve of labor. Doesn't happen very often, and you can kind of argue, there's an argument for that. This is a discussion for taxes later on. So here we are, we're bringing the two together, supply and demand. We always hear the term supply and demand. Nonetheless, again, we always present demand first, again, because it's kind of an easier thing to get your head wrapped around. So this whole idea of supply and demand first came together it was first formally introduced by Alfred Marshall, a British economist, and it was called the Marshallian scissors, etc. It looks like a scissors, right? That equilibrium point is the equilibrium price or the equilibrium quantity supplied equilibrium demand, where the supply and demand intersect, come together, and where we have quantity supplied is equal again to that quantity demanded. This is where markets occur. This is something that, regardless of whether we're talking about Alfred Marshall, this has been something that's going on since time immemorial. This is where markets clear. This is that point at which both buyer and seller are either satisfied equally or dissatisfied equally. Take your pick. Anyway, again, this is supply and demand. It's that equilibrium price. It's the market clearing price. This is where markets are functioning properly, our circular flow, where our households and the firms kind of come together, so far as the household as consumer and also household as provider of productive resource, right? So when the price is at that equilibrium point, of course, that's the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So what happens when this is a direct reference to this competitive model, if you will, the free market model, and this is where prices adjust. Prices make the adjustment if you're not in equilibrium. So, for example, if you're above the equilibrium, price-wise, what you have is what's called a surplus, meaning that the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. And if you go up from that to the new price level above the equilibrium and go across, the first line that you hit is the demand curve and associated quantity demanded. To continue on to the supply curve, the associated quantity supply curve, supply point rather. And that quantity supplied, of course, is greater than that quantity demanded. So the way we get moved back to the equilibrium, of course, is through this price function, meaning that, again, as the price goes down, law of demand says what? Quantity demanded is going to increase. And likewise, or conversely, I guess I should say, as price goes down, what happens to the supply curve? Quantity supplied decreases, moving back down to that equilibrium or that market clearing point. Again, that's the main thing to focus on, is getting back to that equilibrium. So that was the prices above the equilibrium. If their prices are below the equilibrium point, that would be a shortage. And so the opposite, of course, would be the case. If the price is below that equilibrium, the first line that you cross, moving horizontally, moving rightward, if you will, would be the supply curve. And then the next, the associated quantity supplied, and moving to the right, crossing the demand curve, and the associated quantity demanded. Quantity demanded exceeds that quantity supplied. So that would result in a shortage, right? So in order to clear the shortage again, the pricing mechanism comes into play. Price goes up, and you move back to that equilibrium point to clear those prices. So when we talk about surpluses, this is in the context of the market-driven system. There's also, when we talk about a mixed economy, we have government involved. And so we, the citizens of the country, for example, would say, we don't like where the price of labor is at, right? So we say we want the price of labor higher than where that market clearing price is going to be. So we establish a minimum wage. That would be an effective minimum wage, a wage above that equilibrium point. And by doing that, of course, the wage is higher, and we're forced to be at that point. We call it a price floor, meaning that it cannot be lowered any lower. It cannot go any lower than that, and it's above the equilibrium point. So in order to be above that equilibrium point, it has to be an effective price floor. It has to be an effective minimum wage, meaning, again, it has to be above the market clearing price. So let's just assume we're talking about a $15 an hour wage. That would certainly be a minimum wage. If it was a minimum wage of $50 an hour, it would be well above that equilibrium point. And of course, what happens is the same thing as what we see with surplus. You go across from that new price, the $15 an hour price, and what you encounter first will be the demand for that for that labor, and then continuing on, you cross the supply curve for the associated quantity supplied. Quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. And this is when we think about minimum wage, we kind of forget that we're talking about the supplier. In this case, would be the household in terms of the productive resource labor, and the demander, if you will, would be the firm. We usually look at it the other way around. Nonetheless, that would be a surplus, and that would also be an enforced surplus, a price floor, if you will. Okay, so now we go on to our shortages or price ceilings. So what happens with the shortage, of course, is that the price is below that equilibrium point, and the first line that we come across would be the supply curve. So quantity supplied would be less than the quantity demanded, right? And so the way, of course, the way we clear a shortage would be to do what? To raise prices. So when we ask government to step in to put a price ceiling, an effective price ceiling in place, this would come in the form of something along the lines of rent control. It's something that we don't really know much about here in Michigan. We don't see it, but we do see it in places like New York and Los Angeles and parts of LA and San Francisco for sure. And so what that means is that we have a rent control situation, which is a price ceiling, meaning that the landlords, if you will, the apartment owners could only charge a certain amount for that apartment. And so this is something that is put in place again because the citizens request that they want this. They vote for these things. It's very popular so far as the citizens are concerned. But the problem, you run into the problem in that if you have a shortage again of housing, more people want the housing than it's actually available for the price in which it's showing at that, because of that price ceiling. And the reason that you don't have more apartments going up or increased number of spaces is because of the cost to the landowner, the cost to the developer, because it's very straightforward. You walk through the situation with trying to develop a new apartment complex, and what you find is that your costs exceed the actual revenue that you would be getting in, the prices that you would be charging for rent. The rent just is not high enough for you to justify building a new apartment complex, for example. Anyway, those are shortages and price ceilings. So that kind of wraps it up. Surpluses and price floors. Examples of those, again, minimum wage and subsidies, such as like corn subsidies and so on and so forth. Again, we've described those in class. And liquor prices, one more thing out there. So for setting minimum prices for liquor, the lowest you can possibly charge someone for liquor, for example. Anyway, that's it, and I kept it under one hour.